If I showed up to your house with an egg, you would not tell me I was bringing you a cake. Okay? So you'd be like, okay, but thanks for the egg. So why is that? Because it's an ingredient. Now, if I mix it up with flour and baking soda and sugar and butter and all that stuff and stuck it in an oven, I brought you a cake. But if I brought you an egg, I brought you an egg. So when we look at something like narcissism, it's made up of all these pieces: lack of empathy, entitlement, grandiosity, arrogance, the need for admiration and validation, a selfishness, a need for control. And it shows up as manipulativeness. It shows up as gaslighting. It shows up as minimizing, as dismissiveness, in some cases even contempt, betrayal, lying. And these patterns are chronic. It's not just an egg. It's not just selfishness. And I think that the word, we do need the word, because the word captures this thing that hangs together. You wouldn't want to list the ingredients of a cake every time you had a cake. You're like, this is cake, right? It cuts to the chase. But if you don't understand all the ingredients, people often use it as this person's just in love with themselves, which is actually the opposite of narcissism. So we need the word, and I'll tell you why also, because when we understand how this all hangs together, we have a word to describe it, but it also has some dynamics to it. For example, it doesn't really change. So it's telling me now that this bad behavior that this person is engaging in with me, this is not going to change. So there's nothing I'm going to be able to do to fix it. I'm not going to blame myself, and I might want to find a way to disengage from this. That's why the word becomes important. But you tell the narcissist they've got an issue the same way you hug a porcupine, really, really carefully, and prepare for it to hurt really badly.
Wow.
So I actually don't know that it's ever a good. First of all, number one, if you only take one thing out of this episode, only one thing, never call a narcissist out as a narcissist. Biggest mistake you'll ever make, because they're going to come at you with 10 times the vitriol. They will be how dare you call me narcissistic? I am the best. I treat you so well. I have been so good to you. Everyone tells me I'm the best. You know who the narcissist is? You have no empathy. And then before they're done, by the time they're done, you're like, oh, maybe I am the narcissist. So there's no point. Right. So gaslighted is a tactic, okay? And it's a tactic that's used to maintain power, dominance, and control in a relationship by destabilizing the other person. And this destabilization happens by denying the reality, perceptions, experiences, memories, or even knowledge of the other person, and then doubling down and telling that person there's something wrong with you. I never said that. What's wrong with you? Do you have some sort of mental problem that you make some stuff up? So you see, it's not just that I never said that. It doesn't stop there. It's you have a problem. You got to have both pieces. And this is where people sometimes confuse lying and gaslighting. They're not the same thing. Lying is lying, right? Lying is I wasn't there and you were there, okay? A gaslighter will take that and say, I wasn't there, and you know what? I feel like I'm in the relationship with the CIA. You are the most paranoid, weird, needy girl. Like, I'm over this. That's a whole different game, right? The liar's like, I wasn't there. They don't go on to that second step. Gaslighting is a repetitive kind of emotion. They do it over and over again with the goal of completely dominating someone, so they're fully almost on board with the narcissistic person's point of view. That's what it looks like. It's not these other things. It's not a difference of opinion. It's not holding someone accountable. It is attempting to hold someone accountable for something they didn't do, though. That would be gaslighting. It's a very, very problematic tactic, and not just because someone gaslights doesn't make them a narcissist, by the way. All narcissistic people gaslight. Not all gaslighters are narcissistic. You know, they may just be people who are just obsessed with power, and that's their thing, which probably makes them narcissistic-y, but we wouldn't know until we sort of peered under the hood. So that's what gaslighting is. And many times as gaslighting proceeds, many times the gaslighter will literally twist it to a place where they're the victim and you're the perpetrator, and you're thinking, and people believe it. Like I'm a bad person. And that's why many people in narcissistic relationships feel like they're bad people. That you still find it hard to make decisions. Maybe you feel stuck or frozen. You keep going back and forth, or ruminating or second guessing. I don't know what to do, right? That kind of thing. Folks who grew up with narcissistic parents have often found that they have always struggled a little bit with decision making since an early age. Not sure what to wear, or what activity to do, or what flavor popsicle to get. You might wonder, why is that? Well, The stealing of individuation and identity that is the narcissistic relationship contributes to that. The child doesn't exist separately from the parents. They exist for the narcissistic parents. The child's meant to be supply for the parents, and a separate reality is not permitted. What that does is that it percolates a sense of self-doubt in the child. There was never the opportunity for the child to feel that they get to be themselves. So that means knowing preferences or feeling confident or definitive in a choice is really, really hard. As the child gets older, it may show up in difficulties in making choices around choosing peers, classes in school, where to go to school, what to do when they graduate, what major, what job. It just feels harder. And the chronic second guessing can not only be exhausting, then there can be a wave of regret once a decision is made with the person saying, I think I chose the wrong one. But this is not limited to just people who grew up with narcissistic parents. We observe it in people who have had narcissistic partners, especially when it has been a long-term relationship. You hear it enough times, right? You sure about that? I don't know. It doesn't seem like you know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're talking about. You didn't remember that, right? That didn't happen. That happens enough. You doubt yourself at a deep, deep level. Then there is the other issue that, let's say, in a given choice, in a given situation, you make the wrong choice in a situation. We're all going to do it sometimes. You chose the wrong road to drive down, or the wrong hotel, or the wrong refrigerator, or the wrong college. And yeah, it doesn't go well. Well, let me tell you that narcissistic person will be there for the rest of your life with bells on to remind you repeatedly and rub your nose in it for eternity at how you made a mistake and I told you so and what were you thinking? And this can go on for years. So when you throw all of that together, the loss of confidence in your abilities, the loss of identity, the self-doubt, the confusion, the anxiety, the fear of regret, and then the fear that if you do make the wrong decision, that you will be blamed forever, then it becomes pretty clear how and why you would just freeze up like that and it's hard to make a decision, right? The issue then becomes that folks who come through the other side of narcissistic relationships will often have a self-conception of themselves as indecisive or terrible at making decisions or wishy-washy. I'm not sure that is true. That's actually true of you, right? As you come out of a narcissistic relationship, or even if you don't get out of the relationship, you're still in the narcissistic relationship. But now that you recognize what their personality is about, and you do the work of radical acceptance, you then may slowly see that they were peddling a false narrative all along, and you slowly give more and more space and possibility to your sense of self. So the challenge here becomes, Lisa, is that it's almost like we have to start at a foundational level, right? People have to respect and believe in their own reality and respect and believe in themselves. Because otherwise you're vulnerable to someone's words, right? When they're going at you, they're telling you you're incompetent, you don't know what you're talking about, that never happened, who do you think you are? And all this other stuff that leaves a person feeling like they're not enough, or that maybe that other person is right, not them. So all of that is foundational work that most people never do. Then you're in this relationship where somebody is speaking to you in these sort of dismissive, gaslighty, manipulative sorts of ways. There's a moment, and this is the challenge, is that for months, if not years, people believe what that person is saying to them. They actually believe that they're all those bad things, or they're not enough, or they're asking too much, or whatever it is, whatever their partner's going after them for. But there's a moment when it's a penny drop moment. Maybe it's someone's gaslighted you. They've completely denied your reality. And on a strange day, you actually record it and you play it back. You're like, no, I did hear it right. And then over time, you start saying, my reality is actually right. And one of the things I say, I use this a lot in my teaching about narcissism. I call it the DEEP technique. And DEEP stands for don't defend, don't engage, don't explain, and don't personalize. And if you can hold on to those 4 rules, which are not simple rules, they're hard rules, but don't defend, don't engage, don't explain, don't personalize. Don't defend is when somebody is saying you did something and you didn't do it, don't defend it. There's no point, because now what happens is you start going down the rabbit hole. And the don't engage part really means that you pull back quite a bit. You recognize that I'm always walking on eggshells. No matter how I say this, I get it wrong. And the don't personalize piece is this is them, it's not you. And especially the don't personalize piece, that's hard for people. They think it's got to be me. And I'm like, no, it's not you. If anything, you're so empathic that you're easy to take advantage of because they know you're going to keep coming back. So having those 4 simple rules, and those would apply to any kind of relationship. I also tell people it's incredibly important to have other voices in your life, other supports, whether that's friends, colleagues, family members, whoever your people are. What you start seeing is that all these other people are saying, I'm solid, I'm good, I'm kind, I'm competent. One person only is saying these things, and which side you're going to go on. And what makes it harder is if people heard these negating messages in childhood. So because then the narcissistic partner comes along and they're basically reinforcing these messages of I'm not enough from childhood. That's that cycle of defending and rationalizing someone who's saying you're not enough, something we call trauma bonding. You actually justify the narcissistic person. And that's a cycle that started in childhood. The child doesn't have an option. The parent they got. So they will justify that. And so a lot of it is about no longer doing the dance. Let's talk about the parts of narcissism that make it dangerous, okay? Narcissism isn't just about an overgrown adolescent spouse liking bikini pictures on Instagram or flirting with a colleague at work or unfathomable selfishness or a friend always being competitive with you and not caring about your feelings or a narcissistic parent once again wailing that you won't be coming home for the holidays and calling you ungrateful or a selfish brat. It can be that, and it often is. But there are some signs of narcissism that when they come together, we need to sit up straighter and recognize that this is beyond just a heartbreaking annoyance, but something more pernicious and potentially harmful. A very, I think one of the most important papers that's come out in a long time by people called Sophie Kiervik and Brad Bushman that came out a few years ago, I think 2022, found a clear and consistent association between narcissism and all forms of violence and aggression. To me, it was one of the most important papers, like I said, on narcissism that had ever come out, because it really showed the data of what I at least had always suspected. Any one of us in these relationships knew that it felt dangerous, but they finally got the data. Here's the tricky part. Many of us, I shouldn't say most, many of us will never experience physical aggression and violence from a narcissistic person. Now, many of us also will, but it's not the norm. It may get close. And you may get a sense that over time, if I don't stay within the lines, this could get worse. We may see this in coercively controlled relationships that have not gotten to the point of physical violence yet. So we're kept in check simply because of that potential fear of violence and inhibited because of the many ways that a narcissistic person could lash out. It's not just physical. Because most of us are not hit by our boss. Or maybe once upon a time, but we're no longer physically abused by a parent or a sibling. We're just emotionally abused now. We may sometimes underestimate the actual danger of a narcissistic relationship. Narcissism and antagonism, and obviously the close neighbors of personality, such as psychopathy and sociopathy, they're dangerous. Being in a relationship with someone with one of these patterns, these are always going to be harmful relationships. And the harm is typically psychological, but it can show up in other ways too. These patterns are harmful and dangerous for society because narcissistic leaders run workplaces and governments and social agencies, you name it. And then because of those leaders, the people in those systems get harmed. And the narcissistic leaders don't care about the people that they're supposed to lead. Their leadership positions are for them. They're supply for them. It's for their egos, for their power, which is why once a narcissistic person has run an organization, they typically run it into the ground. with little regard for how it has affected the other people. Pay attention to these forecasting signs. The sad thing is, there is a world where we could prevent this kind of violence within relationships, but our laws and systems are not set up to let us do this. We usually wait until after people are hurt to do something. And then in narcissistic relationships, we often get confused by some of the big shiny stuff like charm or charisma or seductiveness, or the not so shiny stuff that plays on our pity and vulnerability, such as victimhood, shame, and pseudo apologies. So let's talk about some of the things, the signs about narcissism that can make it dangerous. First is the thin-skinned quality of narcissism. Whether you make a little joke or give feedback or treat the narcissistic person in any way that implies that they're not special, for example, they have to wait in line, they're not given VIP status, well, that's experienced by them as a narcissistic injury, and that shows a cascade effect. In some cases, it may turn to the victimized, sullen, passive-aggressive direction, and they will punish you with their silence. But it can just as easily turn into a massive grudge that will develop a head of steam, and it will grow over time. And because narcissistic people are also impulsive and have trouble with emotional regulation, especially with emotions such as anger, if the narcissistic person feels let down, they will often attack. And if the narcissistic person feels provoked in any way, even if other people watching it don't think this is a provocation, but if they feel provoked, again, even if they're being told that they are not the exception to the rule, that they have to follow the rules just like other people, and certainly if it is more than that, if you make the mistake of giving them the finger because they cut you off in traffic, or yell at them for taking your seat or taking a parking spot, then it can actually become quite dangerous very quickly. The lack of emotional regulation capacities that narcissistic people have means that things can escalate very quickly in these relationships. And the ego injury quickly turns to shame, which quickly turns to targeted rage at the person that they believe caused the injury, which can then turn to not only impulsive rage in the moment, but also plant the seed of a grudge, a slowly plotted revenge, and they will make you pay for making them look or feel bad. Thus, the very expensive divorces or frivolous lawsuits that you may have faced from narcissistic people. And that takes us to another sign of dangerousness, or another way dangerousness shows up, which is vindictiveness. Narcissistic people hold grudges and need revenge to feel in control. They plot and scheme, the smear campaigns, the flying monkeys, the stalking. It's all part of the revenge. If they view you as someone who made them feel shame, who made them look bad, who made them not feel special, who didn't read their minds and magically make everything okay, they will seek out revenge. And this vindictiveness is why narcissistic people, again, love lawsuits and suing people, and why they will, for months and even years, keep sending you crazy texts and threatening emails. And we may see the very dangerous mashup of breaks from reality and delusionality and all the narcissistic entitlement and the victimhood. And you can see how those things multiply. And the paranoia is fueled by the entitlement, the victimhood, and can result in absolutely tragic circumstances. And because the person who is behaving like this can still sometimes present as normal-ish to law enforcement or other authorities who are assessing the situation, it can get written off to just being a family thing, or people just needing to cool off, rather than something that's a pattern and potentially and regularly harmful. The chronic suspiciousness of narcissism is different than the hypervigilance we see in trauma survivors and narcissistic relationship survivors. Suspiciousness is often an unfounded, exaggerated belief that people are out to not give the narcissistic person what they are entitled to, and that people are almost, not quite, but almost out to really get them, while hypervigilance is a fear that something bad is about to happen. And the physiological and the behavioral and the cognitive changes a person experiences because of these fears and concerns. Arrogance is also tricky when it comes to the danger of narcissistic relationships because it comes down to the swagger and the entitled belief that the narcissistic person will never get caught. And even if they do, nothing will happen to them. And historically, in many cases, this has been true. Either the narcissistic person doesn't get caught, or if they get caught, they know people who can make it all go away, or they're charming enough to get away with it. The family or the partner or other people may ultimately decide to not say anything or to not pursue charges or to just let it go. And if that happens enough, it can really embolden and bolster this sense that the narcissistic person has that they will get away with it. The problem is that the narcissistic danger can escalate over time as the person faces few consequences and nobody leaves them. Ultimately, it may be old age that is the only reason that the narcissistic or antagonistic person slows down, because it does take some energy to yell and do harm to other people. The greatest challenge of the narcissistic and antagonistic personalities is the lack of self-reflective capacity. Narcissistic people can have solid cognitive empathy. They can understand feelings, they can understand your feelings, but because of the low empathy, they really don't care. And it doesn't translate into them ever engaging in compassionate action. The distorted self-conception that narcissistic people have, that they are very empathic, nice people, or long-suffering, victimized people, that they are so nice and great and that the world just mistreats them, means, again, that they feel chronically misunderstood by everyone. But ironically, they completely do not understand themselves. There is a sort of tiny bit of delusion to the narcissistic person. It's not quite enough to qualify as psychosis, but enough to make it that they're clearly not able to self-reflect on their own behavior or on themselves. And this is why therapy with narcissistic clients can be so difficult, and that they often drop out of therapy when the heavy work starts happening. And the thing that may stop most of us from saying something regrettable or acting or lashing out is not just fear of consequences, but not wanting to hurt someone else, recognizing that this is not who we are, and being in touch with our own values and inhibiting ourselves. That loop isn't there for narcissistic people, which is what makes this personality style dangerous. Put simply, narcissistic people kind of don't get it, but more importantly, they don't get themselves, and they kind of don't care. And because that means being in touch with their vulnerability, well, it's not going to happen. So because of that, the narcissistic way is often to scream or shout or punch first and ask for forgiveness later. That's the model that exists for narcissistic people. They want to be able to throw their tantrum, but still have mommy tell them that she loves them afterwards. That works fine for a 3-year-old. It doesn't work well for someone who is 33 or 43 or 53. And on top of that, not only do the narcissistic folks want to have their tantrums and their rages and all of it, they want everyone to forget that it ever happened. And even if you have all the betrayal blindness in the world, your body doesn't forget. All of these patterns, when you take them together, the thin-skinned nature of narcissism, the lack of emotional regulation, the impulsivity, the tendency to believe that they're always a victim and never taking accountability as to their contribution to a situation, and also believing that they should not have to face consequences, the lack of capacity to self-reflect on themselves and their behavior, the suspiciousness, it's all tied up in a big, bright entitlement bow. Interestingly, there are things that can be more protective when it comes to narcissism and the associated dangerousness that this personality style can raise. One of these is the narcissistic person's obsessiveness about looking good to the world and wanting others to think that they're just great. This is where narcissism sort of veers away from psychopathy. Psychopathic and to some degree sociopathic people do not care about that as much, but narcissistic people do. And think of all of these things, if you can, as levers. The more of this caring about the world, what the world thinks, that is present, that strangely, when it comes to dangerousness at least, can be a little protective. Because the narcissistic person can do the calculation that if I get caught doing this, I will look bad. Or there will be a consequence, which I don't deserve, but it may happen. And I won't look good. That can sometimes be protective, especially in more grandiose narcissistic folks. And for this reason, grandiose narcissism may raise less of this terrifying dangerousness issues, and vulnerable and malignant narcissism, especially when they're mixed together, raise more of the interpersonal dangerousness. Why didn't you leave? And I'm like, oh my gosh, such a blamey question. They didn't leave for, let me give you the 500 reasons they didn't leave. I'm very clear. I'm actually amazed when people do leave, to be frank with you, for the amount of courage that it requires to leave one of these relationships. So let's stop asking people, why didn't you leave? Let's stop asking people, well, can't you figure out a different way to say that? There's no different way. You don't think they haven't asked 5,000 different ways before they've ended up at this moment where they're so frustrated? It's our focus has always been seemingly to protect the harmful person in the relationship. Switch it up and start protecting the people who are being harmed.